Hey everybody, this is History and Structure by Alfred Schmidt. This essay is quite long, so it's definitely not going to fit into a single video, but I'm not quite sure how I'm going to organize it yet. So this will probably be the first video out of I don't know how many. So, just so you know. Alright, I'm ready to rock. Section 1, or new section, doesn't have a number next to it. Alright. First section, Science as the Conscious Product of Historical Movement. In view of recent efforts to narrow or even deny the role of the historical in the thinking of Marx and Engels, it should be recalled that at every stage of Marx and Engels' development, Marx and Engels saw in world history a decisive theme. Footnote. On this issue, see my essay Der Structuralistische Angriff auf die Geschichte in Beiträge zur marxistischen Erkenntnistheorie. This essay, which is directed against the Marx interpretation of the Althusser school, as well as against Levi-Strauss, criticizes above all their tendency to eliminate the epistemological problem of subjectivity along with history, considered as human praxis. In the present work, the issue of the textual justification for the structuralist theses concerning this problem will be examined in more detail. End footnote. The German Ideology, a work of fundamental importance for Marx's subsequent conceptions, contains a sentence whose importance cannot be overemphasized. Quote, "We know only a single science, the science of history," end quote. German Ideology. In substance, Marx and Engels never moved away from this view, that we only know a single science, the science of history. The new science, a product of the bourgeois world in general, and of the collapse of speculative idealism in particular, fundamentally transformed the concept of history. Marx and Engels wrote that it, quote, ceases to be a collection of dead facts, as it is with the empiricists, or an imagined activity of an imagined subject, as with the idealists, end quote. German Ideology. Now its, quote, earthly basis, end quote, is recognized. This recognition brings with it the insight derived from the critique of ideology that, quote, formations of ideas, end quote, that were previously held to be autonomous are in fact separated, alienated moments of material praxis and therefore, quote, cannot be dissolved by mental criticism, ... but only by the practical overthrow of the actual social relations, end quote, which give rise to them. And that quote was from German Ideology. Soon after, from the perspective of political organization, the founder of dialectical materialism turned to the relation of the new science to history. I don't believe the term dialectical materialism was used by Marx or Engels, but it was coined by Plekhanov. I'm not precisely sure where, but that's what I believe to be the case. Comment if you think I'm wrong. In The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx argues that it is the level of economic development of society which determines whether the literary representatives of the proletariat come forward as eccentric utopians or genuine revolutionaries. Marx argues that as long as the working class, in consequence of underdevelopment of the productive forces, has not constituted itself politically, that is, quote, as a class for itself, end quote, the working class's advocates will, quote, improvise systems, and seek science in their minds, end quote. The poverty of philosophy. By contrast, in the context of more advanced relationships, the critics have only, quote, to take note of what is happening before their eyes and to become what is happening before their eyes' mouthpiece, end quote. By beginning to grasp the, quote, subversive side, end quote, of the negativity of existing relations, the science of these critics, quote, which is produced by historical movement, has ceased to be doctrinaire and has become revolutionary, end quote. Poverty of philosophy. Footnote. These remarkable accounts of the relation between the representatives of critical proletarian literature to the world historical process and to its driving forces in economic classes are based on the model of the anti-feudal struggle for emancipation waged by the West European bourgeoisie. In his 1947 polemical article directed against Karl Heinzen, I think it's supposed to say 1847. Anyway, in his 1847 polemical article directed against Karl Heinzen, titled Moralizing Criticism and Critical Morality, Marx wrote concerning that struggle, quote, the writer may very well serve a movement of history as that movement of history's mouthpiece, but the writer can not, of course, create that movement of history, It was much more the case that the principles and theories put forward by the writers of the bourgeoisie during the bourgeoisie struggle against feudalism were nothing but the theoretical expression of a series of real events. Indeed, one can see that the extent to which this expression was more or less utopian, dogmatic, or doctrinaire corresponded exactly to the degree of advancement of the phase of real historical development, end quote. Marx. Indeed, for Marx, the character of bourgeois emancipation as a model for proletarian emancipation refers not only to its method and direction, but to its goal as well. The French Revolution up through the Paris Commune is crucial for Marx's theory of revolution. Yet Marx's theory pays insufficient attention to the politically decisive fact that even before 1789, the French bourgeoisie controlled the instruments of production, which according to Marx the proletariat was not supposed to appropriate until after the proletariat's revolution. End footnote. It is not valid, writes Marx, the mature economic analyst, to create science on the basis of a priori principles rather than on, quote, the critical knowledge of the historical movement, end quote, which generates, quote, the material conditions of emancipation, end quote. Marx, in a letter to J.B. Schweitzer, January 24th, 1865. Footnote. See also the off-sided forward to a contribution to the critique of political economy of 1859, in which Marx wrote that mankind sets mankind's self only tasks that mankind can accomplish. End footnote. This interest in the present as sedimented and still to be formed history is constitutive for the Marxist idea of a revolutionary science. It is pervasive in Marx's Capital, a work with whose detailed interpretation Russian Marxism begins in a theoretical and practical sense. As Marx writes, it is, quote, the ultimate aim of this work to reveal the economic law of motion of modern society, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Marx attaches the utmost importance to the idea that the dialectical method proceeds simultaneously in a structural analytic and a historic manner. In Marx's words, quote, it includes in its positive understanding of what exists a simultaneous recognition of what exists, negation of what exists, inevitable destruction, end quote. Marx, Capital Volume 1. Of course, these ideas, as familiar as these ideas are indispensable, cause epistemological difficulties, of which Marx and Engels were well aware. Because of Marx and Engels' contemporary relevance, of these ideas' contemporary relevance, these ideas will be discussed in more detail. New section, quote, development, and quote, existence of the bourgeois relations of production. From the notion that the new science, bracket, historical materialism, in bracket, must be understood as the, quote, conscious product of historical movement, end quote, it does not at all follow that in it knowledge simply coincides with the historiography of it does not at all follow that in it knowledge simply coincides with the historiography of its subject matter. This, in the words of contemporary structuralists, quote, historicist interpretation, from Lukács's History and Class Consciousness to Marcuse's Reason and Revolution, could play such a considerable role in the literature on Marxism and history because it points out the moment which was decisive for differentiating the Marxist from the Hegelian dialectic. For Hegel as well as Marx, reality is process, quote, negative totality. In Hegelianism, this process appears as a system of reason, that is, as a closed ontology, from which human history sinks to the level of being, its derivative, a mere instance of its application. By contrast, Marx emphasizes the independence and openness of historical development, which cannot be reduced to a speculative logic that all being must forever obey. Hence, quote, negativity comes to refer to something that is fixed in time, while, quote, totality implies the whole of the modern relations of production. Particularly in the Grundrisse, the, quote, rough draft of Capital, Marx derives these modern relations of production in a concrete historical manner. These modern relations of production do not, Marx writes, develop, quote, out of nothing, nor from the womb of the self-developing idea, but from within and in antithesis to the existing development of production and the inherited traditional relations of property, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. However, once it has emerged, the bourgeois condition constitutes a system which can be explained in that system's own terms. The, quote, conditions of its becoming, end quote, Marx writes, using Hegelian categories, pass over into, quote, results of its presence, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Certainly an imminent presentation of the system has its limits, for when carried out rigorously, it immediately refers back, quote, toward a past lying beyond this system, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Conversely, and here Marx goes beyond Hegel, the analysis leads, quote, to the points at which the suspension of the present form of production relations gives signs of its becoming, foreshadowing of the future, end quote. Marx. Therefore, to the extent to which Marx combats bourgeois economics, which views, quote, capital as an eternal and natural, not historical form of production, end quote. Grundrisse. A shift from the logical to the historical, as well as a reference to the past and future development of the present, is necessary. Of course, we should note the manner in which history comes into play here as a constructed concept, parenthesis, konstruierter Begriff, in parentheses, not as a narrative history filled with content. The latter constitutes the indispensable horizon of Marxist research, not in any sense its theme. The critique of political economy, a methodologically essential standpoint, analyzes capital in the historical, quote, first stages of capital's becoming, end quote, viewing the historical, quote, first stages of capital's becoming, end quote, is lying beyond capital yet preserved and augmented by capital itself. As a result, for Marx, it is unnecessary to, quote, write the actual history of the relations of production, end quote, if one wants to develop the, quote, laws of bourgeois economics, end quote. Marx. Grundrisse. There's a footnote that I missed. The representatives of the Parisian Althusser school are in agreement with this view when they insist that the real object of Marx's capital avoids the opposition which dominated previous discussions between abstract theoretical economics and a concrete conception of history. Nikos Palantzis writes that Marx's capital is, quote, neither an, quote, economic or a, quote, historical work in the direct sense. Rather, capital is a work that permits the theoretical construction of the subject matter of history and economics, locating the concept of history and that of economy in different modes of production, and circumscribing the economic as a sphere of theoretically specified structures for which a specific historical concept is developed, namely that of the process of transformation of forms, end quote. Nikos Palantzis. On this issue, as well as on the structuralist interpretation of the mature Marx in general, the Althusserian study, Marxism is not a historicism, which is not really a study to my memory, it's a chapter in Althusser's The Object of Capital, which is on this channel. End footnote. Precisely for this reason, in Capital, Marx energetically stresses that the process of cognition is characterized by a relative autonomy in face of its object, and hence does not simply reproduce the historical process of this object. Quote, reflection on the forms of human life, hence also a scientific analysis of those forms of human life, takes a course directly opposite to the forms of human life's real development. Reflection begins post festum, and therefore the result of the process of development already at hand. The forms which stamp products as commodities, and which are therefore the preliminary requirements for the circulation of commodities, already possesses the fixed quality of natural forms of social life, before man seeks to give an account not of their historical character, for in his eyes they are immutable, but of their content and meaning. End quote. Marx. Capital, Volume 1. New section. The cognitive primacy of the logical over the historical. The subjective and objective beginnings of knowing are as little identical to one another as are the conceptual mediation and the real history of a thing. In this matter, Marx follows the critical method of Feuerbach, who had already argued that, quote, only he whose result stands in direct contradiction to his conscious beginning is a truly genetic thinker, end quote. Feuerbach. This expresses only a surface and hence provisional and, quote, transcendable, end quote, truth. Thus Marx's major work, Capital, does not, as one might at first expect, begin with the developmental history of capitalist relationships, but rather with the immediately given everyday fact that the wealth of capitalist societies appears as, quote, an immense collection of commodities, end quote. Marx, Capital Volume 1. From the abstraction of the commodity, the analysis elevates its determinate forms to the level of concrete categories: exchange, money, circulation of commodities, and finally capital. Only subsequently does Marx deal with the actual labor process as such, a process which temporarily precedes the circumstances expressed in the categories. In fact, Marx first treats material relevant to the emergence of the capitalist mode of production in the 24th chapter of Volume 1 of Capital. In Chapter 24, the emergence of the capitalist mode of production appears under the title of, quote, primitive accumulation. That is, as the, quote, process which operates two transformations, whereby the social means of subsistence and production are turned into capital, and the immediate producers are turned into wage laborers, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Marx would not have been successful in unfolding the content of the historical presuppositions of capital's emergence had he not first grasped the essence of capital theoretically. Marx would not even have known where and how they were to be found. It is for this reason, according to commentators such as M.M. Rosenthal, that the chapter on primitive accumulation, quote, only has the purpose of confirming and illustrating with actual history the origin of capital disclosed by logic, end quote. M.M. Rosenthal. Footnote: on the problematic of the, quote, logical method in Capital, see M.M. Rosenthal, Die dialektische Methode der politischen Ökonomie von Karl Marx. The question concerning categorical presentation, kategorialer Darstellung, is dealt with further by Helmut Reichelt in his important study zur logischen Struktur des Kapitalbegriffs by Marx. End footnote. As strange as it may sound at first, the mature Marx placed the history of capital on scientific foundations by proceeding on an abstract theoretical rather than a historiographic level, in adhering strictly to the logic of capital, and thereby disregarding all moments of the empirical course of events which interfere with this logic and are thus non-essential to it. Marx comes closer to the historical content of empirical history than Marx would have had Marx been content with chronologically following developments immediately at hand. Whoever studies the materialist dialectic must confront the contradiction that, on the one hand, its founders did not allow themselves to be impressed by the vicissitudes of the real historical process. In Marx's words, they primarily investigated the, quote, ready-made world of capital, end quote. Whereas on the other hand, they tacitly assumed at all levels of their analysis that the, quote, economic structure of capitalist society, end quote, emerged historically out of the, quote, economic structure of feudal society, end quote. Marx, Capital. Without abandoning a materialist basis, all conceptual operations in Marx and Engels' work rest, directly or indirectly, on the movement of the sensuous, that is, the material world. The theoretical thinking of Marx and Engels assumes a, quote, constructive, constructivant character. It contains history in concentrated form rather than its unmediated copy. It is particularly important to stress the above in view of the fact that Engels, intent on making the reading public conscious of the qualitatively new element of Marx's method, in his famous review of the contribution to the critique of political economy, had to stress the unity of, rather than the difference between logic and the logical and the historical within materialism. Engels wrote that the, quote, German political economy, end quote, initiated by Marx has its, quote, essential foundation, as its, quote, essential foundation, the materialist conception of history, end quote. Engels. This conception in turn would be unthinkable, Engels continues, without the, quote, exceptional historical sense, end quote, of Hegel, the first thinker who attempted, quote, to set forth, a science in its specific inner coherence, end quote, one bound up with the coherence of the historical process. Engels here accentuates the Hegel-Marx parallelism between the, quote, evolution of ideas, end quote, and the, quote, evolution of universal history, end quote, more than is justifiable either in terms of textual grounding or in relation to the interests of a theory that wants to avoid vulgar Marxist misunderstandings. Footnote. In this matter, as in others, Marxism owes a great deal to Hegelian philosophy, specifically the much discussed section, Independence and Dependence of Self-Consciousness, Lordship and Bondage in Phenomenology of Mind, has been rightly interpreted, together with German idealism in general, as being a speculative theory of the French Revolution, that is an attempt to conceptualize the French Revolution's world historical quintessence, a task that does not mean writing the French Revolution's history. As in Capital, the sequence of the phenomenology does not leave the ground of history at any point. Quote, that's not a quote, that's dirt. Yet it is not thereby present. Yet it does not thereby present a thoroughgoing parallelism between reality and the spirit. End footnote. Engels emphasizes how very eager Marx is to ground in a new, namely materialist way, the, quote, abstract, distorted manner, end quote, of the process of cognition present in Hegel. Marx does so, Engels writes, by grounding this process, quote, in history, end quote. The point was to bring to a scientifically usable form the dialectic which, even in the dialectic speculative Hegelian version, quote, had cope with the whole of the former logic and metaphysics with the greatest of ease, end quote. Engels. As a critical method of political economy, the dialectic can be either logically or historically accentuated. Marx opts for a, quote, logical form of approach, end quote. Engels, to Marx's material, in order not to explode his material's immanence with theoretically superfluous secondary matters. But Engels continues, the logical method deviates from historical method only in a relative sense. Each is reflected in the other. The logical, theoretical, or as Marx also said, analytic method, quote, is, indeed nothing but the historical method only stripped, of diverting chance occurrences. The point where this history begins must also be the starting point of the train of thought, and its further progress will be simply the reflection in abstract and theoretically consistent form of the historical course. Though the reflection is corrected, it is corrected in accordance with the laws provided by the actual historical course, since each factor can be examined at the stage of development where it reaches its full maturity, its classical form, end quote. Engels. And I just a side note, this Engels' interpretation of this, and I don't know what Schmidt's going to say, but this interpretation is of Marx's Critique of Political Economy, which was extremely influential, is highly controversial. Check out the piece, The Myth of Simple Commodity Production by Christopher J. Arthur on this channel for a critique of this understanding of capital. And I believe if you look at the works of Michael Heinrich on this channel, he says a similar thing, but I can't remember precisely. In the abstract sense, it is correct that materialist philosophy requires ongoing contact with objective reality, which possesses objective reality's own self-movement, and that objective reality's categories do not express timeless essences, ontological structures, but rather, quote, forms of thought which are socially valid and therefore objective for the relations of production belonging to this historically determined mode of social production, end quote. Marx, Capital. Even the most abstract categories, Marx forcefully demonstrates this in connection with, quote, labor, are valid only in the context of specific relationships. Engels also never tires of emphasizing that the historical and the logical, seen as a whole, coincide with and form a unity which really is grounded in the historical. Quote, only the historical gives determinate form to abstraction and predestines its place and its role in Marx's theoretical system, end quote. Rosenthal. Engels' review also mentions numerous historical documents, excursus, and inserts of an illustrative nature in Marx's economic works. They both interrupt and confirm its logical nature by always referring it back to real and concrete history. The founders of Marxism were proven historians, and authorities on the important bourgeois historiography of their century. Marx and Engels were just as preoccupied with questions concerning economic and social history, questions which were first thematized in a rigorous manner through their materialist method, as they were with the political history of the time, not to mention their detailed knowledge and insights into historical literature, above all in the area of economic scholarship. Their works on the revolutions of 1848, Engels' The Peasant War in Germany, and Marx's The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte and Theories of Surplus Value come to mind. In these writings, historical development provides, in Engels' words, quote, a natural clue, which the critique could take as a natural point of departure, end quote. Engels. In them, sequences of time and of ideas penetrate one another. On the other hand, the relationship between the logical and the historical methods presents itself differently when we turn our attention in a structural manner to the problems concerning the whole of bourgeois economics, then logic and history. This becomes clear in Marx. Separate are connected only in a highly mediated way. Of course, the unity of method remains intact. The, quote, historical content, end quote, still constitutes the, quote, real foundation, end quote, of the thought process. In its specifically contemporary meaning as historical writing, which is nomothetically oriented. The latter approach is emancipated from slavishly, quote, reflecting factual material. When the neo-Kantian Lange, in his book on the labor question, claimed that Marx moved, quote, with singular freedom, end quote, through the empirical material, Marx accepted the notion positively and explained, quote, Lange hasn't the least idea that the, quote, free movement through the material, end quote, is nothing but a paraphrase for the method of dealing with this material, that is, the dialectical method, end quote. Marx, letter to Kugelmann, letter of June 27, 1870. From this follows the at first glance astonishing sentence from Marx in the very important introduction to the Critique of Political Economy. Quote, it would therefore be unfeasible and wrong to let the economic categories follow one another in the same sequence as that in which they were historically decisive. Their sequence is determined rather by their relation to one another in modern bourgeois society, which is precisely the opposite of that which seems to be their natural order, or which corresponds to historical development. End quote. Marx, Marx Grundrisse. Introduction. It seems right here, this kind of characterization right here of that Marx is putting forward seems quite distinct from the depiction of the what you might call the the method of explication of the Critique of Political Economy, right? Engels talks about like kind of like a historical presentation, a historical theoretical presentation. Like I think they refer to actually Engels' interpretation of Marx's Critique of Political Economy as the historical logical interpretation, the historical logical interpretation, which is basically says that the Critique of Political Economy is historical in the sense that it's kind of like a glossing over history, excluding kind of like the extraneous details in order to get to the core of like a historical development, right? And that's kind of how he like interprets capital, right? In a certain sense, he thinks that like, for instance, for Engels, I think I'm not exactly sure, but I think one of the things that he argues is that like, the transformation between labor values or value of commodities to the commodities prices of production and to market prices is like kind of like a temporal sequence, right, between the three volumes of Capital, right? Once upon a time, say in like simple commodity production, when people were like, I think there's a quote from Engels to this effect, when people were living in smaller communities, they kind of had a conscious understanding of the way that value, the conscious understanding of like the labor time that went into commodities, and that's what they were kind of orienting what they were willing to exchange for commodities based on kind of like firsthand knowledge of the amount of labor that it took to produce said commodity. And then with the development of capitalism, in which the different the level of labor intensity of different industries diversified, prices, commodity prices were no longer dictated by value, but rather by prices of production, which is dictated by the cost of inputs plus the average rate of profit, right? So like commodities with wildly different physical labor inputs acquired the same amount of value, even though labor creates all value, right? So he kind of talks about those things in like a very like sequential kind of way. Once upon a time, labor values, later prices of production. Whereas in Marx, whereas based upon this thing, which talks about this passage here, where it says their sequence is determined rather by their relation to one another in modern bourgeois society, which is precisely the opposite of that which seems to be their natural order or which corresponds to historical development, right? It means in this paragraph, it appears to me Marx is saying that is kind of indirectly rejecting Engels' thesis that the presentation of the critique of political economy is a historical presentation with kind of the fat trimmed away, right? That's not what Marx seems to be, how Marx seems to be conceptualizing his own presentation, or this is from the Grundrisse, but what would be necessary for the explication, the presentation of the critique of political economy. It seems like he's saying, no, it's not sequential, right? And this is kind of and it seems like this is kind of probably one of the insights of Althusser. I think Althusser was kind of he's kind of influenced on Michael Heinrich, and I think also to a certain degree on the Neue Marx-Lektur in general. One of the things that, at least for Michael Heinrich, I'm not so sure about Backhaus and Reichelt, but for Heinrich, following Althusser, talks about capital being a depiction of the capitalist mode of production in its ideal average, not in terms of an empirical average of taking all kinds of different empirical features of different capitalist economies and then kind of saying, oh, these are the ones that are most common, or something like that. That would be a empirical average. And I think in this ideal average thing is this is why Althusser rejects historicism, which he uses again. I don't know if I might have said this already in this video, but Althusser definitely uses the word historicism in a strange way. When I think of historicism, what I think when I think of myself is the notion that capitalism is something historically specific, right? It seems like when he's saying it's not historicism, when he's talking about the Marxist Capital, it seems like he's talking about it not being a book of history. At least that was my interpretation. That could be very wrong, and I could be fucking way off the mark with that, but that seemed to be what he was saying. What was I going to say? Yeah. So basically, what I started talking about is that there seems to be a distinction between how Marx conceptualizes the presentation of the critique of political economy and how Engels interprets Marx as presenting the critique of political economy. It's not capital is not written as a historical sequence, right? It doesn't go from simple commodity production to production based on capital and so on and so forth. Yeah. Just some thoughts from me. I apologize if you had to listen to my marginalia. New section: Analytic and Dialectical Reason in Hegel. The primacy of the logical is to be understood in a cognitive sense, and not as if the categories are the existential ground of reality that is mediated through categories. Similarly, it is clear that the Marxist concept of a constructive, quote, mode of presentation, end quote, Darstellungsweise, of the scientific object, which is formally distinguished from the, in the broadest sense, empirical, quote, mode of inquiry, end quote. Forschungsweise is taken from the Hegelian system. Unquestionably, in making this distinction, Marx was thinking of Hegel's argument in the introductory reflections of his philosophy of nature concerning the relationship between scientific analysis and speculative dialectic. Quote, "The material prepared out of experience by physics is taken by the philosophy of nature at the point to which physics has brought it, and reconstituted without any further reference to experience as the basis of verification. Physics must, therefore, work together with philosophy so that the universalized understanding which it provides may be translated into the notion by showing how this universal, as an intrinsically necessary whole, proceeds out of the notion. The philosophic manner of presentation is not arbitrary. The philosophical manner of presentation does not stand on its head for a while because it has gotten tired of using its legs. The ways of physics are not adequate to the notion. For that reason, advances have to be made." End quote. Hegel, was that Science of Logic? Well, I gotta get back to the footnotes again, so forgive me. And what's the footnote? 42. Footnote. Never mind. But that quote is from Hegel, Philosophy of Nature. And back to the text. What raises the, quote, rational, end quote, presentation of a structured whole above the, quote, understanding, end quote, activity of inductive research in individual areas is the structure of categories proper to it. In Hegel's words, the, quote, range of universal thought determinations, ... as it were the diamond net into which we bring everything in order to make it intelligible, end quote. Hegel, Philosophy of Nature. Thinking of what pushes forward to abstract generalities and rests satisfied with abstract generalities is indispensable, but it is unable to penetrate the determinate content. It remains, according to Hegel, quote, split up, dismembered, particularized, separated, and lacking in any necessary connection within itself. End quote. Hegel, Philosophy of Nature. Hence, analytic knowing, contrary to analytic knowing's own claim, remains a, quote, abstract and therefore limited empiricism. For Hegel, placing the mere working up of sensuous data above reflection on them constitutes a, quote, wrong way, end quote. Further, quote, intuition has to be submitted to thought, so that what has been dismembered may be restored to simple universality through thought. This contemplated unity is the notion, which contains the determinate differences simply as an immanent and self-moving unity, end quote. Hegel, Philosophy of Nature. Footnote. I have consciously drawn on Hegel's Philosophy of Nature, a work with which Marx was familiar. For all its obtruseness, it is of great interest today, especially with regard to its methodological project. Hegel's explanation of the qualitative difference between analytic and dialectical reason in physics serves the purpose of the present study, insofar as modern sociology has been oriented largely on the model of the natural sciences since Saint-Simon's, quote, physicism. End footnote. New section. The Marxian ascent from the abstract to the concrete. Marx takes up, on a materialist basis, the Hegelian method of ascending from the abstract to the concrete, and therefore Hegel's critique of conceptless empiricism. As Marx as well as Hegel for Marx as well as Hegel, scientific knowledge has a, quote, presenting, Darstellenden, rather than a descriptive character. The, quote, concrete at which scientific knowledge aims is precisely the opposite of what common sense means by the term, the classifiable individual fact, but refers instead to a synthetic knowledge, a conceptualized, quote, unity of the diverse, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. The Marxist dialectic resists, as did the Hegelian dialectic, the strict dichotomy between facts and ideas. It is not a, quote, subsumption of a mass of, quote, cases under a general principle, end quote. Marx. Rather, the Marxist dialectic theorizes that universal social production should be grasped as a concrete universal. Particular constituent elements such as distribution and exchange and consumption are not a chaotic sum of fixed data organized in a manner external to distribution, exchange, and consumption, or constituent elements such as distribution, exchange, and consumption. Rather, according to Marx, particular constituent elements, such as distribution, exchange, and consumption, constitute objective, quote, members of a totality, ... distinctions within a unity, end quote. Marx, which is established by the overarching moment of production. In line with this argument, Marx explicitly rejects the merely, quote, analytical method, end quote, of classical economics, which is not interested in, quote, how the various forms came into being, end quote, but believes instead that the merely, quote, analytical method of classical economics can immediately and completely reduce these forms to these forms' unity. Marx argues that it holds this position because it dogmatically, quote, starts out from them, bracket, the forms, and bracket, as given premises, end quote. Marx. Theories of surplus value. Marx leaves no doubt that analytic thinking is a necessary foundation of, quote, genetic presentation, of comprehending of the real, formative process in the formative process's different phases, end quote. Marx. Theories of surplus value, part 3. But because this process, the real object of knowledge, does not coincide immediately with the real course of history, analysis at most can, as demonstrated by the beginnings of economic scholarship in the 17th century, quote, discover ... a small number of determinate, abstract general relations such as labor, division of labor, money, value, etc., end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Presented in this manner, these general abstract general relations such as labor, division of labor, money, value, etc., remain isolated moments of a totality whose living structure is not actually derived from the necessity of its own concept. However, to the degree to which these categories, which emerged from history and were developed through analysis, quote, had been ... established and abstracted, end quote, and had lost the trace of their empirical origins, the economists adopted another method. Now their systems began to ascend from the simple to the complex. and the economist turned from labor and labor's division, from needs and exchange value, to the state, commerce between states, politics, and the world market. Marx Grundrisse. Or see Marx Grundrisse. For Marx, this shift constitutes the, quote, scientifically correct method, end quote. Marx Grundrisse. However, it does contain, in the form of a conceptual concentrate, the history of political economy as science and as empirical reality. The Marxian method is a logical process which takes as the Marxian method's point of departure a, quote, chaotic conception of the whole, end quote, and by means of more abstract steps arrives at a, quote, rich totality of many determinations and relations, end quote. Marx Grundrisse. The method's dialectical structure expresses the method's dialectical structure self in the equal consideration the method's dialectical structure gives to the moments of the, quote, false and the, quote, true, that is, to the historically surpassed route of early economics, along with, quote, the full conception, along which, quote, the full conception was evaporated to yield an abstract determination, end quote, as well as the deductive path of later economics, on which, quote, the abstract determinations lead toward a reproduction of the concrete, end quote. Marx Grundrisse. In this connection, Marx also explains his relation to Hegel, the view that logical operations, in contrast to a sensuous inventory of facts, make possible knowledge that is more concrete and richer in content, approaches Hegel's. Quote, illusion of conceiving the real as the product of thought, concerning, concentrating thought's self, probing thought's own depths, and unfolding thought's self out of thought's self by thought's self, whereas the method of rising from the abstract to the concrete is the only way in which thought appropriates the concrete, reproduces the concrete, bracket, as something permeated with concepts, and bracket, as the concrete in the mind. But this is by no means the process by which the concrete itself comes into being, end quote. Marx Grundrisse. Of course, this non-identity of knowledge with the real genesis of the known not only indicates the fundamental materialist circumstance that the, quote, concrete totality, as a totality of thoughts, end quote, is always the product of the, quote, working up of observation and representation into concepts, end quote. These concepts do reveal the essence, but do not, as moments of the, quote, the, end quote, concept, create the essence. The non-identity of knowledge and knowledge's object points to something more specific, namely, that the Marxian method, regardless of the Marxian method's difference from the Hegelian method, accepts the Hegelian method's highly complex critique of empiricism so far as the Hegelian method, as far as the latter's, let me repeat that sentence. The non-identity of knowledge and knowledge's object points to something more specific, namely that the Marxian method, regardless of the Marxian method's difference from the Hegelian method, accepts the Hegelian method's highly complex critique of empiricism so far as it, as has been repeatedly emphasized here, accords to the actual theoretical process far greater autonomy than is evident in most interpretations. New section, quote, inquiry, Forschung, and, quote, presentation, Darstellung, in the speculative dialectic. Marx's suggestions in the afterword to the second edition of Capital concerning the unity of and distinction between, quote, inquiry and, quote, presentation suggest that were rigorously carried out in his material studies, had their exact model in Hegel, his great reflection on the relation between empiricism in the individual disciplines and concrete history on the one hand and philosophical theory on the other are strewn throughout his whole work. I will now discuss a passage, unfortunately rather extensive, from Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy, a passage that refers to Francis Bacon. In spite of its speculative language, it anticipates Marx's project of a, quote, dialectical presentation, end quote, especially clearly. Quote, empiricism is not merely an observing, hearing, feeling, etc., a perception of the individual. For empiricism really sets to work, to discover laws. Now, because empiricism does this, empiricism comes within the territory of the notion. Empiricism, thus prepares the empirical method for the notion so that the notion can revise the empirical material for the notion's use. If the science is perfected, the idea must certainly issue forth from the idea's self. Science as such no longer commences from the empirical, but in order that this science may come into existence, we must have the progression from the individual in particular to the universal, an activity which is a reaction to the given material of empiricism in order to bring about its reconstruction. Without the working out of the empirical sciences, on the empirical science's own account, philosophy could not have reached further than philosophy did with the ancients. The whole of the idea, in the idea's self, is science as perfected and complete, but on the other side is the beginning, the process of its origination. The process of its origination this process of the origination of science is different from science's process in itself when it is complete, just as is the process of the history of philosophy and that of philosophy itself. Every science begins with principles. In the beginning, these principles are the results of the particular. But if the science is completed, the principles are made the starting point. The case is similar with philosophy. The working out of the empirical side has really become the essential condition of the idea, so that it can reach its full development. In consciousness, it then adopts the attitude of having cut away the bridge from behind it. It appears to be free only in its ether, to launch forth, and to develop without resistance in this medium. But it is another matter to attain this ether as well as development within this ether. End quote. Hegel, Lectures on the History of Philosophy. Let us reflect on these ideas of Hegel's that were of such importance to Marx's conception of science. First, it is apparent that the great idealist, Hegel, does not at all haughtily brush aside Bacon's principle of methodically knowing individual facts, but rather considers it as necessary, especially for the speculative philosophy itself. In his view, the finite is as constitutive for the infinite as the infinite is for the finite. No absolute contradiction exists between sensuous and conceptual knowledge. All experience contains, quote, theoretical, end quote, elements, and thus a pure immediacy is impossible. Hegel accepts the sciences that had developed since the Renaissance for, quote, knowing from the absolute, end quote, as if it is not to assert empty theses, requires the extensively and intensively developed, quote, particularity of the content, end quote. Hegel, Lectures on the History of Philosophy, Volume 3. The latter is provided by concrete inquiries. Concrete inquiries provide intellectual labor with the indispensable factual foundation. However, to the extent to which, quote, empiricism, end quote, does not exhaust empiricism's self in a mere piling up of the sensuous given, but rather aims at grasping objective laws, empiricism already finds itself, as Hegel writes, quote, within the territory of the notion, and prepares the material for the notion. Consequently, there is in Hegel, and in Marx as well, no unbridgeable gap between modern analytic and dialectical science. The second point which emerges from these considerations is perhaps even more important from a Marxist perspective. Hegel stresses that science, as Hegel understands it, as the, quote, concrete idea, the, quote, system, once, quote, complete, must no longer start out from the empirical but from itself. In order to achieve this autonomy, science must, in Hegel's view, rely on, quote, the development of the experiential sciences themselves, end quote. Hegel. In relation to philosophy, however, the task of the latter consists only in becoming dispensable. The speculative science is completed when the, quote, whole of the idea in the idea's self, end quote, is attained with empirical assistance. It floats free, as it were, of its real basis, and the, quote, process of its origination, end quote, is reduced to the external, merely abstract, quote, beginning, end quote. Although just this loss and reduction demonstrates the dubiousness of idealism, it does not follow that Hegel's thought should be simply rejected. Insofar as the Marxian critique of political economy refers strictly to the bourgeois relations of production, the Marxian critique of political economy draws on the Hegelian insight that the, quote, process of origination, end quote, of a science must be distinguished from science's, quote, process in itself, end quote. Just as the, quote, process of the history of philosophy is distinguished from that of philosophy itself, end quote. Hegel, Lectures on the History of Philosophy. According to Hegel, in every science's beginning, every science orients that science's self to axioms which are the, quote, results of the particular, end quote. Hegel, Lectures on the History of Philosophy, Volume 3. Once developed, these axioms are governed by these axioms' own logical character. Still, Hegel hints that this sphere of, quote, pure, end quote, conceptual immanence, removed from all historical development, always contains an illusory, Marx would have said, quote, ideological moment. The system that is alienated from history nevertheless remains imprisoned in history. New section. From, quote, system to history. We now turn to Marx himself. Marx's theory follows Hegel's insofar as he also seeks to present bourgeois society, irrespective of bourgeois society's historical origin, as a closed system that is, one, explicable in terms of itself. Marx's theory follows Hegel's theory insofar as Marx also seeks to present bourgeois society, irrespective of present bourgeois society's historical origin, as a closed system, that is, a system explicable in terms of that system's self. Marx argues that although this system is the direct result of the conscious acts of living individuals, this system blindly and violently establishes this system's self over against this system's creators. Because in economic terms, the value character of the products of labor first manifests the value character of the products of labor's self on the market in magnitudes of value, which exchange, quote, independently of the will, foreknowledge, and action of the exchangers, end quote. These magnitudes assume, quote, the form of a movement made by things, and these things, far from being under the control of humans, in fact control humans, end quote. Marx, Capital. Hence the often misunderstood focus of Marx's theory essentially on the object should be understood as a critical theory rather than as a kind of worldview or confessional creed. Marx's theory's goal is that the hitherto unconsciously governed forces should in the future be subjected to the consciousness of solidary individuals. Marx's Capital and the studies preliminary to Marx's Capital deal with the condition in which a human creation appears with the merciless harshness of a being in that being's self. For example, Marx writes that in the money fetish, quote, a social relation, a definite relation between individuals, appears as a metal, as a stone, as a purely physical external thing, which can be found, as such, in nature, and which is indistinguishable in form from its natural existence, end quote. Marx, Capital. Marx Grundrisse, forgive me. Theory makes this immediacy transparent only with great difficulty. In everyday life, this immediacy remains completely opaque. The rigidified thing-like congealed relationships between people who are reduced to becoming mere bearers and silent instruments for carrying out these relationships form a negative totality, which in turn is the specific object of dialectical materialism. As has already been emphasized, Marx does not investigate the capitalist world primarily as an economic and social historian, but rather investigates the capitalist world from the viewpoint of the capitalist world's developed structure, that is, a, quote, existence of value, end quote, which is achieved, quote, purity and universality, end quote. Marx abstracts from the history of landed property in which modern capital originated. The latter is a mode of production in which, as Marx writes, quote, the individual product has ceased to exist for the producer in general, and where nothing exists unless it is realized through circulation, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. For Marx, all historical presuppositions which Marx had thoroughly studied of fully developed capital, are only those of, quote, its becoming which, end quote, along the lines of Hegel's logic, quote, are overcome and preserved in capital's being, end quote. All historical presuppositions of fully developed capital, quote, belong to the history of capital's formation, but in no way to capital's contemporary history, i.e., not to the real system of the mode of production ruled by capital, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Marx is dealing with a, quote, system in the strict deductive sense rather than with a historiographical task, because the form of capital which the system develops produces its own conditions of existence and no longer does so, quote, as conditions of its arising, but as results of its presence, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. The forms which temporarily precede capital lie behind the system, just as, quote, the processes by means of which the earth made the transition from a liquid sea of fire and vapor to its present form now lie beyond the earth's life as finished earth, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. At first glance, this separation, absent in Marx's early writings of empirical history and imminent, quote, presentation, end quote, of the categories, offends against the principle that is continuously and justly stressed in materialist literature, the mutual interpenetration of the historical and the logical. Footnote, of course, already in the German ideology, in contrast to the mere collection and ordering of historical materials, the qualitatively higher concept of the, quote, presentation, of, the thing in the thing's totality, end quote, emerges, although in undeveloped form. End footnote. Actually, however, such is not the case. Marx, as I emphasized at the outset, as strange as it may sound at first, comes closer to the real course of history when Marx proceeds on a logical constructive path than when he is satisfied with depicting it in its immediate and therefore false concreteness. The method tested in Capital, Marx's Capital, like the Hegelian method, was not a tool external to the subject, but rather reproduced the subject's, quote, reproduce the subject's necessary, quote, process in itself, end quote. The method tested in Marx's Capital's goal is to treat the capitalist process as a whole, so that the capitalist process's objective logic, free from accidental as well as ideological accessories, will become evident. Marx himself characterizes the task he had set himself in the following manner, quote, the work in question is a critique of economic categories or the system of bourgeois economy critically presented. It is a presentation of the system and simultaneously, through the presentation, a criticism, end quote. Marx to Lassalle, letter of February 22nd, 1858, end footnote. This important double aspect of the Marxist method leads us from the logical back to the historical theoretical problematic. We started out from the idea that Marx analyzes the structure of capital by consciously disregarding the particularities of capital's historical emergence. Marx focuses on capital's developed form. Of course, capital appears in capital's unmediated form as money, for which labor power is bought as a commodity on the market. Marx investigates the exchange process between commodities and money, and then demonstrates the manner in which the latter changes into capital. According to Marx, money originates in circulation and is, quote, the first concept of capital, the first form in which capital appears, end quote. Marx Grundrisse. As Rosenthal's study underscores, this purely logical analysis simultaneously constitutes the, quote, key to the history of capital, end quote. Rosenthal. As Rosenthal's study underscores, this purely logical analysis simultaneously constitutes the, quote, key to the history of capital, end quote. Rosenthal. A history which Marx neglected primarily on systematic grounds. Indirectly, however, Marx showed that bourgeois modes of production necessarily presuppose what Marx substantively pointed out in the chapter on primitive accumulation in capital, that, quote, on the one hand, owners of money, end quote, and, quote, on the other hand, free laborers, sellers of their own labor power, end quote, stand opposite one another. And those quotes are from Marx's Capital. In addition, as Rosenthal also indicates, the Marxian analysis implies that history reproduces history's self with every new act of the reproduction of capital. To this extent, quote, the logical analysis, end quote, Rosenthal writes, is, quote, at the same time the historical analysis. The historical analysis only appears as the opposite of the logical analysis, end quote. Rosenthal. In other words, the logical and the historical coincide, although in a very mediated fashion. How money changes into capital is, first of all, a historical question. Marx recalls that modern society came into being in the 16th century with world trade. Where am I? I lost my spot. How money changes into capital is first of all a historical question. Marx recalls that modern society came into being in the 16th century with world trade and the world market. The personal relations of domination and bondage resting on landed property were dissolved through the anonymous power of capital, which first appeared as money, property, and as merchant and usury capital. Quote, money, commodity, commodity, money, ... This movement of buying in order to sell, which makes up the formal aspect of commerce, of capital as merchant capital, ... is the first movement in which exchange value as such forms the content, is not only the form but also its own content. End quote. Marx Grundrisse. Marx's term, the, quote, determination of the form, end quote, form Formbestimmung of trade, an expression that aptly characterizes his scientific interest, theoretically guarantees that, in his words, quote, we do not need to look back at the history of capital's origins in order to recognize that money is its first form of appearance. Marx has termed the, quote, determination of the form, and, quote, Formbestimmung of trade, an expression that aptly characterizes Marx's scientific interest, theoretically guarantees that, in Marx's words, quote, we do not need to look back at the history of capital's origins in order to recognize that money is capital's first form of appearance. Every day the same story is played out before our eyes. Even up to the present day, all new capital, in the first instance, steps onto the stage, i.e. the market. Whether it is the commodity market, the labor market, or the money market, in the shape of money which has to be transformed into capital by definite processes, end quote. Marx. Capital. Accordingly, the general theory of this transition is not to be developed historically, but rather, Marx argues, on the basis of laws which are immanent to commodity exchange. The parallelism of such formulations to those in Hegel's work is obvious, just as the idealist system of philosophy, once rounded off and self-defined, left the idealist system of philosophy's historical premises behind, like a shedded skin. So the bourgeois relations of production, appearing in the money form of capital, constitute a system, quote, in process, end quote. Prozess irrendes System, whose functioning must be explained through rigorous conceptual labor. New section. The problem of the starting point of science. As is well known, Marx seeks to accomplish a difficult task such as this one, by taking as his point of departure the commodity or value form of the products of labor. He calls it the, quote, economic cell form, end quote, of bourgeois society, one which makes it possible to reveal it as a, quote, intensive totality. Like a Leibnizian monad, the commodity reflects in the commodity self the whole world conditioned by its structure, a point to which Lenin drew particular attention. In Lenin's summary of Hegel's Science of Logic, Lenin investigates Hegel's theory of the notion, especially from an epistemological viewpoint, and thus establishes that the, quote, formation of bracket abstract and bracket concepts bracket already includes and bracket consciousness of the law-governed character of the objective connection of the world, ... Just as the simple value form, the individual act of exchange of one given commodity for another, already includes in undeveloped form all the main contradictions of capitalism. So the simplest generalization ... already denotes man's ever deeper cognition of the objective connection of the world, end quote. Lenin, Philosophical Notebooks. And elsewhere, again alluding to the theoretical process in Capital, Lenin writes, quote, the beginning, the most simple ordinary mass, immediate, quote, being, the single commodity, bracket, Sein, in political economy, and bracket. The analysis of it as a social relation, the double analysis, deductive and inductive, logical and historical, bracket, forms of value, and bracket, end quote. Lenin. Philosophical notebooks. It says, see page 30 of volume 38 of Lenin's collected works, where Lenin emphasizes that the, quote, idea of the social relations of production, end quote, constitutes the, quote, basic idea of the Marxian, quote, system, end footnote. In other words, Lenin continues, Marx's Capital also offers a, quote, history of capitalism, end quote. But as he expressly adds, it does so in the form of a, quote, analysis of the concepts forming it up, end quote. Lenin. Philosophical notebooks. Here Lenin was thinking of the systematic construction of the first volume of Capital, a construction which is simultaneously a historical and a logical construction insofar as the sequence commodity, money, capital, with which Marxist economics begins, reflects the real process which was supposed to have led to the origin of capital. Since the prehistory of this process is characterized by the production and circulation of commodities, the logical beginning of Marxian analysis coincides with the genetic beginning of the object it studies. As Engels puts it, the line of reasoning must certainly begin at the point where the actual history begins. But it would unquestionably be wrong to claim on this account that Marx wanted to describe the development of modern society because Marx's Capital begins with the analysis of the commodity. As we know, the reason is a specifically theoretical reason. The commodity appears as the, quote, elementary form, end quote, of bourgeois wealth, and, quote, the commodity form is the most general and the most undeveloped form of bourgeois production, end quote. Marx, Capital. It is, and this is what matters, the abstract in the Hegelian sense, something conceptually still unspecified and poor in content, from which an ascent is made with an inner necessity to more concrete, more differentiated knowledge by way of highly subtle abstractions. As a result, there exists a developmental logical connection between the categories produced by the analysis of commodities, the insight into the objective antagonism of the world of the bourgeois world, and the prediction of the bourgeois world's collapse. What the beginning implies, the end confirms. For as Hegel writes, the, quote, progress from that which forms the beginning is to be regarded as only a further determination of it. Hence, that which forms the starting point of the development remains at the base of all that follows and does not vanish from it, end quote. Although it gradually becomes increasingly mediated, the beginning is, quote, the foundation which is present and preserved throughout the entire subsequent development, remaining completely immanent in its further determinations, end quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. As a dialectical thinker, Marx thought a great deal about the simultaneously unmediated and mediated character of the beginnings of theory. In doing so, he was clearly oriented to what Hegel's famous segment, titled, "With What Must the Science Begin?" had to say on the subject, deeply grounded in the history of dogma, Marx knows very well that his starting point in the analysis of commodities, labor is concrete and abstract activity that brings forth use value and exchange value, in no sense originates only from his intentional choice or from the composition and genesis of the object of his research. Rather, the starting point stems as well from the general path of the science of political economy. The development of the science of political economy proceeds in such a manner that scholars, Marx mentions the physiocrats in reference to the question of value, frequently treat problems in a more complicated form before they are in a position to secure the elementary initial evaluations necessary for more advanced work. In general, as Marx demonstrates, quote, the historical path, end quote, of the sciences, quote, leads only through a multitude of contradictory moves to the real point of origin, ... As distinguished from other master builders, science builds not only castles in the air, but may construct separate habitable stories of the building before laying the foundation stone, end quote. Engels, Karl Marx, A Contribution, end footnote. New section, the quote, progressive regressive, end quote, method. Hence, the, at first curious, situation must be considered that the subjective advance of knowledge is objectively, in regard to its content, a step backward. Here Marx followed the structure of Hegel's science of logic, and as Lefebvre and Sartre put it, its, quote, progressive regressive, end quote, method. In the science of logic, Hegel discusses the recent view that philosophy, first of all, must be a, quote, quest, because philosophy can begin only with, quote, hypothetical and problematic truths, end quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. Wait. Shit. No. It's not Hegel. It's, no, it is Hegel. Science of Logic. Hegel was impressed with the related and clearly developing interest in the speculative problematic of the, quote, beginning, end quote, and used the opportunity mainly to come to an understanding of the, quote, meaning of the, quote, meaning of logical advance, end quote. Above all, of the view claiming, quote, that progress in philosophy is rather a retrogression and a grounding, ... by means of which we first obtain the result that what we began with is not something merely arbitrarily assumed, but is in fact in part the truth, in part the primary truth, end quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. Hegel elaborates on and specifies this view, a view important for Marxist theory, in saying, quote, that the advance is a retreat into the ground, to what is primary and true, and which depends, and in fact, from which originates, that with which the beginning is made, ... This last, the ground, is then also that form which the first precedes, that which at first appears as an immediacy, ... The essential requirement for the science of logic is not ... that the beginning be a pure immediacy, but rather that the whole of the science be within itself a circle, in which the first is also the last, and the last is also the first. End quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. We will now investigate the modifications undergone by this important Hegelian theorem as it reappeared in Marxian economics. In Marx's view, the beginning and end of the analysis of bourgeois processes of production are determined by, quote, the real and the concrete, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. In his important outline of a materialist method, Introduction to a Critique of Political Economy, written in 1857 to 1858, Marx understands the, quote, real and concrete, end quote, to be the foundation of all, quote, perspectives and conceptions, end quote, which he intends to analyze conceptually. It emerges twice, as the, quote, point of departure, end quote, of the process of cognition, and as its, quote, result, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. In the first case, the real and concrete refers to the closed immediacy of the wealth of commodities typical of capitalist society, whose structure, which is decisive for the whole epoch, Marx illuminates through, quote, microscopic, end quote, analysis of individual aspects. In the latter case, the, quote, real and concrete, end quote, refers to the intellectually mastered whole of such unmediated facts, that is, these unmediated facts' inner law-like coherence at which science aims. But this coherence, no less than the dialectical operations which mediate this coherence, may not be, quote, mystified, end quote. Marx criticizes Hegelian philosophy for such mystification, since, quote, conceptual thinking, end quote, is not the, quote, real human being, end quote. And, quote, the conceptual world as such is not the only reality, end quote. The first immediacy, what in conventional terms is called the, quote, concrete, coincides with the concrete of a higher order, which it proves itself to be once it has been theoretically penetrated. Whether theory succeeds in penetrating the concrete, the real object, quote, retains the real object's autonomous existence outside the head as just before. Namely, as long as the head's conduct is merely speculative, purely theoretical, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. The materialist dialectic of the actual process of cognition develops between, quote, point of departure, end quote, and, quote, result, end quote. Both considered separately are abstract moments. In view of the historical theoretical dimension of this dialectic, we will examine it once again. Hegel, in Hegel's Science of Logic, considers the progressive development of the idea. It is closer to the development from, quote, being to, quote, essence, becoming totally transparent as the notion, from, quote, a state of knowledge that is undeveloped and devoid of content to one full of content and truly grounded, end quote. Hegel views this as a stage-by-stage return of the empty beginning into its, quote, ground, which gives it full content. This is an idea which the mature Marx also takes up. Marx also carefully investigates the progression from external surface, quote, appearances, unquote, of economic reality to their, quote, essence inner laws. That is, Marx also returns to the, quote, ground of the, quote, existence of these, quote, appearances, unquote. Marx, as well as Hegel, is convinced that, quote, retrogressive grounding of the beginning, ... and the progressive further determination of the beginning, end quote, takes place uno actu. Wikipedia, AI Overview, Google AI Overview says uno acto is a Latin phrase meaning, quote, by one act, or, quote, by a single act. It signifies that an action or event occurs in a single unified instance rather than through a series of separate steps. The term can also be interpreted as, quote, in a single act, end quote. Back to the text. Certainly, this makes all the difference. Hegel's logical categories, when translated into political economic categories, assume a completely different character. Above all, Hegel's logical categories lose Hegel's logical categories timeless closed validity because the, quote, ground, end quote, which mediates the beginning, the given commodity world, and toward which knowledge moves, is not an absolute concept, but rather the history which bursts all logical immanence and can never be spiritualized. However much Marx, in deriving the concept of capital from the economic form of exchange, and not from its natural or historical content, endeavors to explain the mechanism of bourgeois production completely within bourgeois production's own terms. Marx is not ready to capitulate in the face of the existing system as such. Indeed, Marx writes that it is superfluous, quote, to write the real history of the relations of production, end quote, in order to, quote, develop the laws of bourgeois economy, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. But, Marx continues, it is precisely the logical method, apparently removed from anything historical, which, quote, indicates the points at which the historical investigation must enter in, or where bourgeois political economy points beyond bourgeois political economy itself to earlier historical modes of production, bracket 2a and bracket past lying behind this system, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. This past is depicted by Marx in chapter 24 of the first volume of Capital, dealing with, quote, primitive accumulation, end quote, the real development of the essence, the Hegelian, quote, ground, end quote, of that which the theoretical labor of that work begins. New section. The location of capitalism in universal history. Second. Sorry. I had to open another tab that had the endnotes in it. So forgive me. Bourgeois society is methodologically so important for dialectical materialism because it is the, quote, most developed and most complex historic organization of production, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Introduction. Marx stresses the degree to which the appropriate understanding of the past depends on the correct grasp of the present, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse, Introduction. Excuse me, just the Grundrisse, not the introduction. The critical analysis of the given structure, according to Marx, quote, allows insights into the structure and relations of production of all the vanished social formations out of whose ruins and elements it built itself up, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse, Introduction. The richly articulated system is the basis on which the history which determines it can be revealed, not the reverse. This insight distinguishes the dialectic from shallow evolutionism. In both natural and social history, quote, the intimations of higher development, end quote, among lower levels can be understood only, quote, after the higher development is already known, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse, Introduction. Hence, the specifically bourgeois political economy provides the, quote, key, end quote, to the social life forms that precede bourgeois political economy. For Marx, this merely underscored the necessity of not forgetting the difference while grasping the identity between bourgeois political economy and bourgeois political economy's predecessors. Bourgeois categories and the circumstances that find expression through bourgeois categories may also, Marx writes, emerge before the bourgeois era, quote, developed or stunted or caricatured, end quote, always, however, quote, with an essential difference, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse, Introduction. Marx then adds a remarkable reflection on the concept of historical development. Quote, the so-called historical presentation of development is founded, as a rule, on the fact that the latest form regards the previous forms as steps leading up to the latest form's self. Since it is only rarely and under quite specific conditions able to criticize itself, bracket, in a fundamental sense, end bracket, it always conceives them one-sidedly. The Christian religion was able to be of assistance in reaching an objective understanding of earlier mythologies when the Christian religion's own self-criticism had been accomplished to a certain degree, so to speak, potentially. Likewise, bourgeois economics arrived at an understanding of feudal ancient Oriental economics only after the criticism of bourgeois society had begun, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. From the standpoint of universal history, capitalism marks a sort of high point. Once present as a functioning system, capitalism serves theoretically as a principle of explanation of capitalism's past as well as future development, and hence also explains precisely those driving forces which undermine capitalism's systematic character. When Marx discusses the manner in which money is transformed into capital, Marx feels compelled to add that, quote, the dialectical form of presentation is correct only if the dialectical form of presentation recognizes the dialectical form of presentation's own limits, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. These being the points at which living history penetrates into a nature-like rigidified system. These being the points at which living history penetrates into a nature-like rigidified system. The general concept of capital can be derived in a purely deductive manner from, quote, simple circulation, end quote, because in the bourgeois mode of production, the latter, quote, itself exists only as a presupposition of capital and is something which in turn presupposes capital, end quote. Marx. But this does not, as Marx remarks with an evident sarcasm directed at Hegel, transform capital, quote, into the incarnation of an external idea, end quote. Marx. Grundrisse. Rather, it shows, quote, how in reality capital must first enter as a necessary form only in production based on exchange value, end quote. Marx. Grundrisse. Considerable difficulties emerge, of course, concerning the lawfulness of this transition from circulation into capital when Marx presents its historical character in a logical rather than historiographical manner. Marx writes, quote, the simple circulation is ... an abstract sphere of the bourgeois production process as a whole, which ... through its own determinations proves itself to be ... a mere phenomenal form, Erscheinungsform, of the process of industrial capital which lies behind it, results from it and produces it, end quote. Marx. Grundrisse. Money becomes capital by being exchanged for non-capital, that is, for the labor capacities of individuals. That is not precisely true. Capital can purchase labor, money can purchase labor capacities without becoming capital, if what is produced by those labor capacities is not just a use value, but a commodity. So if a rich person pays a butler, that's not capital. Just a side note from myself. That's just an opinion from me. Marxian economics is a system and at the same time not a system. For what forms the totality of bourgeois society is equally that which ceaselessly pushes beyond it. As an immanent critique, Marx assumes that the relationship Marx investigates exist, quote, in pure form corresponding to their... As an immanent critic, Marx assumes that the relationships Marx investigates exist, quote, in pure form corresponding to those relationships' concept, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. But as a critic, Marx knows how little, not only in England in that period, that is the case. Socialism cannot rest with Philistine research contributions. Rather, socialism sees socialism's self as the, quote, antithesis to political economy, end quote, which, of course, as Marx always acknowledges, finds its point of departure, quote, in the works of classical political economy itself, especially in Ricardo, who must be regarded as its complete and final expression, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Marx views Ricardo so favorably because Ricardo is essentially different from the superficial, vulgar empiricist economics in that Ricardo bluntly articulates the antagonistic character of the dominant relations of production. Further, in his studies of liberal competition, Marx demonstrates that Ricardo is sharp enough at least to raise the question of the transient nature of the capitalist condition, one which he personally viewed as an incontestable natural form of human life. Competition, that is, competition's negatively historically effective side, dissolves the collective constraints and restrictions which are naturally bound to pre-bourgeois stages. Marx immediately observes, in a manner indebted to the critique of ideology, that in the analysis of this process, it is important to avoid the persistent error which suggests that the, quote, absolute mode of existence of free individuality, end quote, arises out of it. What, from the perspective of many-sided developed competition, appears as a limit of earlier modes of production, was in these modes themselves the, quote, inherent limits, ... within which they spontaneously developed and moved, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. That is not an actual deficiency at all. Marx stresses that, quote, these limits became barriers only after the forces of production and the relations of intercourse had developed sufficiently to enable capital as such to emerge as the dominant principle of production. The limits which it tore down were barriers to its motion, its development and realization. It is by no means the case, in contrast to what bourgeois apologetics still claim today, that it thereby suspended all limits, or all barriers, but rather only the limits not corresponding to it, which were barriers to it. Within its own limits, ... it feels itself free and free of barriers, i.e. as limited only by itself, only by its own conditions of life, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse, and it and all those things was capital. Especially with Marx, I think it's important to try to follow the, pronouns, I guess it is. I don't know. I'm used to thinking of pronouns in terms of people, but I guess like it, following the its is what I'm trying to do. So sometimes you'll hear me say the same word over and over again. That's because I'm substituting it for it, so I don't get lost, and hopefully that keeps you from getting lost as well. The aspect of free competition referred to the completed, quote, system of bourgeois society is even more important for Marx. In it, capital relates, quote, to capital's self as another capital, end quote. Its, quote, inner laws, end quote, which appear in the quote, preliminary historic stages of its development, end quote, merely as anticipatory, quote, tendencies, from now on are, quote, posited as laws, end quote, and actually become effective as such. Marx continues, quote, production founded on capital for the first time posits itself in the forms adequate to it only insofar as and to the extent that free competition develops, for it is the free development ... of its conditions and of itself as the process that continuously reproduces these conditions, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Marx objects to interpreting the role of competition in an overly optimistic manner. In Marx's view, it is not living individuals and individuals' needs who are emancipated by competition, but rather capital, which with free competition begins capital's, quote, real development, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. What is inherent in the general nature and concept of competition now presents itself as the, quote, external necessity, end quote, which dominates the many individual capitals. The many individual capitals' competition, which includes the competition of the worker with his or her equals, means, quite simply, that they, quote, force the inherent determinants, end quote, of capital in general, quote, upon one another and upon themselves, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. As long as the bourgeois mode of production is the most appropriate historical form for advancing the universal growth of the productive forces that serve the human species, the ideology that goes along with this mode of production contains a moment of truth. According to this ideology, of necessity, quote, the movement of individuals within the pure conditions of capital appears as those individuals' freedom, which is then also again dogmatically propounded as such through constant reflection back on the barriers torn down by free competition. End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Footnote. On the objective dialectic of chance and necessity, which is important for Marxist theory in general, see Capital, Volume 1, page 429. In addition, see Hegel, Philosophy of Right, in which Hegel writes that the task of political economy is to work, quote, upon the endless mass of details which confront political economy at the outset, and extracting therefrom the simple principles of the thing, the understanding effective in the thing and directing it, end quote. Hegel. End footnote. To the extent to which the, quote, reciprocal compulsion, end quote, which competing capitals, quote, exercise upon one another, end quote, leads to the, quote, free, and at the same time the real development of wealth as capital, end quote. Marx. Competition becomes a scientifically and economically decisive category. Even Ricardo presupposes competition's, quote, absolute predominance in order to be able to study and to formulate the adequate laws of capital, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. The higher the level of competition, the more successful this effort will be. It is the former which, as the argument goes, determines how purely the forms of movement of capital manifest themselves. Marx then shows that Ricardo, by firmly adhering to these premises, was compelled to make an admission which transcends the bourgeois horizon. Objectively, what appeared in his conceptualization is, quote, the historic nature of capital and the limited character of free competition, which is just the free movement of capitals and nothing else, i.e., the capital's movement within conditions which belong to no previous dissolved stage, but are capital's own conditions, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. That free competition of this kind moves into the center, not least of all in the political struggles of the preceding century, does not mean that the capital relation is grounded in the movements of many capitals. Rather, the predominance of competition implies that capital as a historic life form has in fact already established capital's self and only appears in the facts in the foreground of the circulation sphere. This was stated, albeit without consequences, by the best representatives of classical economics. In particular, it did not enable them to see that the ahistorical, quote, systematic nature, end quote, systematitet of the existing society is itself historically produced. Ultimately, the classical economists fall into what Marx, in the section of Capital on the fetish character of commodities, calls objective illusion, or gegenständlichen Schein. This illusion is reinforced, Marx writes, by the movement of capital, quote, according to capital's own laws, end quote. Marx. As soon as capital no longer needs the, quote, crutches of past modes of production or of those which will pass with its rise, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Certainly, the systematic nature of the bourgeois world proves itself to be ever more fragile. This is so because in capital, whose historical victory it once made possible, the expansion of the productive forces, and therefore human freedom, come up against a barrier which cannot be transcended in a manner immanent to the system, but rather only through a qualitative leap beyond the system. Marxist theory points to the familiar conclusion that capital assumes which appear to complete its domination, increasing the concentration of capital gradually, dismantles free competition, while in truth it announces its collapse. Marx argues that when liberalism, in liberalism's classical form and in liberalism's contemporary extension, equates the, quote, negation of free competition, end quote, in the planned economy with the, quote, negation of individual freedom, end quote, liberalism overlooks the fact that its kind of, quote, individual freedom is, at the same time, the complete subjugation of individuality under social conditions which assume the form of objective powers, even of overpowering objects, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. For Marx, the recognition of these objects as historical products of human beings and the condemnation of their separation of the latter from the objectified instruments of their labor as a reprehensible form of domination constitutes, quote, an enormous awareness, end quote. Marx, which the theory itself, growing out of these relations, must articulate or even construct for the first time. Footnote. Marx, Grundrisse. This idea again makes clear the limits of the structuralist Marx interpretation as it is put forward by the Althusserian school in Paris. For example, Nikos Poulantzas differentiates two disciplines within the unity of Marxism on the basis of their different objects, dialectical and historical materialism. Historical materialism, quote, the science of history, end quote, defines historical materialism's object as the, quote, constitution of the concept of history, end quote, Poulantzas. Dialectical materialism, quote, Marxist philosophy, end quote, is understood by Poulantzas in a gnosiological sense. It is concerned with, quote, the production of knowledge, that is, the structure and functioning of the process of thought, end quote, which amounts to a, quote, theory of the history of scientific production, end quote. Poulantzas, in Political Power and Social Classes, translated by Timothy O'Hagan. Poulantzas is certainly right when Poulantzas emphasizes how mistaken it is to reduce materialist epistemology to the materialist conception of history. Poulantzas rejects the, quote, historicist interpretations, end quote, whereby he mentions the young Lukács and Korsch, in which Marxism is a, quote, historical anthropology, of which history is an originating and basic category rather than a concept to be constructed. Reflection on structures, quote, gaining consciousness of their meaning, end quote, is a function of the structures themselves, which are interiorized in a process of mediation, end quote. Poulantzas. The question arises whether Poulantzas, who with his teacher Althusser wishes to obliterate all Hegelian traces in Marxism, does not, in this manner, fall into the contrasting mistake which Phalancis himself designated as, quote, positivist empiricist interpretations, end quote. Phalancis. Such interpretations narrow historical materialism to the barren skeleton of a universally valid, quote, law or, quote, model, which from time to time is only to be, quote, concretized with historical examples. How else should one interpret Phalancis's thesis that historical materialism deals primarily with the, quote, concept of history? Doesn't this concept presuppose the study of the content of the course of history? In other words, narrative history? This is something which Phalancis will probably admit, if only in abstracto. Of course, in Marx's Capital, there is, quote, constructed, end quote, history, but also in the materialist sense, creative, quote, praxis, end quote. It is hard to understand why a dialectical theory is supposed to bring both concepts into unmediated, even unmediatable opposition, as is the case with Phalancis. End footnote. The characteristic specific to the method of the mature Marx, this much is evident from what has been discussed up to this point, is that the method of the mature Marx serves the explosive power of the historical dialectic by following the path of logic. History which transcends the present does not enter Marx's system as an externally introduced product of Marx's worldview, but rather, at least according to Marx's ideas, is derived strictly from its own premises. References to the past lying behind the bourgeois world appear polemically everywhere in Marx's Capital. References to the past lying behind the bourgeois world appear before the well-known 24th chapter, either becoming directly constitutive for the cognition process or finding their location in the, quote, logic of presentation, end quote. In order to transform money into capital, money's owner must find the free worker, the modern proletarian on the market. The question as to why the capitalist comes across this worker in the sphere of circulation does not interest the capitalist at all. In the labor market, the capitalist quite rightly sees a, quote, particular branch of the commodity market, end quote. Marx, Capital Volume 1. And to begin with, the question interests Marx just as little. As Marx writes, quote, we confine ourselves to the fact theoretically as he does practically, end quote. Marx, Capital Volume 1. In other words, Marx enters into the systematic presuppositions of Marx's object, but Marx does not capitulate before the systematic presuppositions of his object. Quote, one thing ... is clear. Nature does not produce on the one hand owners of money or commodities, and on the other hand men possessing nothing but their own labor power. The relation has no basis in natural history, nor does it have a social basis common to all periods of human history. It is clearly the result of a past historical development, the product of many economic revolutions, of the extinction of a whole series of older formations of social production. The economic categories already discussed similarly bear a historic imprint. Definite historical conditions are involved in the existence of the produce as a commodity. I think it's supposed to be product. The various forms of money, the various forms of money, indicate very different levels of the process of social production. Yet we know, that a relatively feeble development of commodity circulation suffices for the creation of these forms. It is otherwise with capital. It is otherwise with capital. The historical conditions of capital's existence are by no means given with the mere circulation of money and commodities. Capital arises only when the owner of the means of production and subsistence finds the free worker available on the market as the seller of his own labor power. And this one historical precondition comprises a world's history. Capital, therefore, announces from the outset a new approach in the process of social production. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. This passage underscores Marx's view that it is no longer necessary to uncover the developmental historical origin of capital once it has developed and the moments of its formation have, quote, disappeared, end quote, into a system which allows for a rigorous immanent critique. This principle, which is absolutely essential for dialectical thinking, nevertheless requires a correction because it illuminates only one side of Marx's relationship to the classical economists. When one bears in mind that from the outset, Marx studied Smith and Ricardo with reference to Smith and Ricardo's own results and intentions, it becomes clear that Marx's critique pursued a qualitatively different goal than Smith and Ricardo themselves did. It is not out of mere archival interest that Marx returns again and again to the nodal points at which the immanent presentation must give way to a historical presentation. Rather, the reason is found in the analysis itself. The analysis which defines the bourgeois system in relation to the bourgeois system's past indicates just as much that this system was relative to a, quote, movement of becoming, end quote, which this system transcends. Quote, just as on one side the pre-bourgeois phases appear as merely historical, i.e. suspended presuppositions, so do the contemporary conditions of production likewise appear as engaged in suspending themselves, and hence in positioning the historic presuppositions for a new state of society, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Again, it becomes apparent at a point decisive for Marx's whole conceptual framework that the logical method, properly understood, is also the most appropriate method for understanding historical development. It permits the grasp of the antagonistic whole. In Engels' words, quote, at the stage of development where it reaches its ... classical form, end quote. Engels, Karl Marx, A Contribution. As Hegel writes in The Science of Logic, quote, the highest maturity, the highest stage which anything can attain, is that in which its downfall begins, end quote. Hegel, The Science of Logic. It is on the basis of just this view, one which permeates all of his individual assertions, that Marx observed capitalist reality. Footnote. In view of the structuralist interpretation, it should be emphatically stressed that even capital, Marx's capital, in spite of and as a consequence of its method, which is focused on objectivity, contains the idea supporting the whole of Marxist analysis that what matters is to make transparent the developed and developing nature of existing structures and to mediate them with practical subjectivity. The enduring contribution of history and class consciousness is to have pointed this out energetically. Thus, in Lukács's essay, Reification and Class Consciousness of the Proletariat, which is especially instructive for the future construction of a Marxist historical method, Lukács shows that the difficulties which Hegel fell into because of the relationship between absolute spirit and history, quote, world spirit, remains unexplained. By suspending real history, Hegel's philosophy comes to a timeless conceptual kind of genesis, one taken over from, yet at the same time denying reality, a genesis which moves from logic through nature to spirit. Quote, but as the historicity of all categories and categories' movements introduces decisively into the dialectical method and as dialectical genesis, and history necessarily belong together objectively, ... This process, which had been designed to be suprahistorical, inevitably exhibits a historical structure at every point, end quote. Lukács, History and Class Consciousness, translated by Rodney Livingstone. Thereby, Hegel's method takes on a, quote, abstract contemplative, end quote, character, which on the one hand causes Hegel's method to, quote, falsify and do violence to, end quote, history. On the other hand, quote, history will gain history's revenge and violate the method which has failed to integrate history, tearing that method to pieces, end quote. Hence, here Lukács recalls Marx's critique of Hegel, the, quote, demiurgic role of the, quote, spirit, end quote, will manifest itself as pure, quote, conceptual mythology, end quote. Just as sharply, Lukács attacks the tendency of modern theorists of history, of Rickert's type, to remain immersed in the crude immediacy of the factual, tied, of course, to, quote, values, end quote, which allow only a, quote, selection, end quote, from their abundance, leave facticity itself unchanged, and confront facticity only accidentally and externally. What is thereby achieved is merely, quote, a formal typology of the manifestations of history in society using historical facts as illustrations, end quote. On the other hand, what Lukács has in mind is a binding self-interpretation of historically moved being, that is, a theory in which objective reality of events is not described from a neutral external standpoint, but rather as one in which the world historical content of these events becomes transparent. Therefore, Lukács emphasizes that it was only with Marxism that the dialectic actually could become a, quote, method of history, end quote, by devolving on the proletariat a class, quote, which was able to discover within itself on the basis of its life experience, ... the subject of action, the, quote, we of Genesis, end quote, Lukács. Quote, the historical knowledge of the proletariat, end quote, on the basis of Marx's Capital, end quote, the historical knowledge of the proletariat, end quote, on the basis of Marx's Capital, quote, begins with knowledge of the present, with the self-knowledge of its own social situation, and with the elucidation of its necessity, i.e. its genesis, end quote. Lukács. End footnote. Hegel knows how far its immediate forms of... Marx knows how far how far its immediate forms of appearance fall short of what his theory offers in insights into its essence. However much the false society for an indeterminate time may grow, it is a self-dissolving form of the world spirit, one condemned by the court of universal history. Against the background of these considerations, we can now look at the complex relation of system and process, logic and history in the mature Marx, and can do so in its more fundamental aspect. New section. Valid and invalid aspects of the structuralist Marx interpretation. In Marx's Capital, Marx advocates anything but an unreflected historicism in which knowledge runs directly parallel to the chronological course of events. Structuralist interpreters, such as Althusser and Palancis, are correct up to this point. Beyond this point, when they flatly deny the constitutive role of Hegelian logic for Marx's economic work and denounce a, quote, theoretical anti-humanism and anti-historicism, end quote, agreement comes to an end. For Marx's texts offer no evidence to support such an interpretation. In Capital, Marx does not, as the structuralists have claimed, reject either the theme of history or that of human nature as being ideological as such. On the contrast, in the later Marx, as is evident not least of all in the Grundrisse of 1857, we are dealing with a second appropriation of Hegel, especially the Hegel of the science of logic. The science of logic is as important for Marx's political economic analysis in the 1850s and 1860s as the category of labor taken from the phenomenology of mind was for Marx's, quote, self-understanding, end quote, Selbstverständigung, in the 1840s. Of course, in Marx's Capital, in this regard one can agree with the structuralists. There is no dogmatically established anthropology, no abstract humanistic, quote, image of man, end quote, external to the scientific process of cognition. But it would be a mistake, on this account, to claim that Marx was a, quote, theoretical anti-humanist, end quote. Marx's effort to analyze the commodity was implicitly humanistic insofar as it rose above the conventional level of national economy. Because Marx refuses merely to register the reified, pseudo-objective structures of capitalist everyday life, but seeks instead to bring the history congealed in the reified pseudo-objective structures of capitalist everyday life back to life, Marx comes up against the specifically human, if deformed, reality. Hence, in Marx's view, even capital is not a thing, quote, but a social relation between persons which is mediated through things, end quote. Marx. Footnote on the implicit humanism of Marx's theoretical efforts. See also my study Die Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, Geschichte und gegenwärtige Bedeutung. End footnote. The reduction of these people to mere, quote, representatives of the world of commodities, end quote, is a negative condition that is yet to be historically transcended, not a scientific norm. God, that's good. I'm going to copy this down for later. Where the hell am I? Sorry, this is annoying, but it's good shit. Sorry. Some good shit. Alright. My bad. Back to the text. In spite of his undeniable rational interest in history, something which linked Marx to Kant, Marx in Capital does not really proceed historically, but rather, schooled in Hegel's Science of Logic, aims at the, quote, basis and possibility of a synthetic science, of a system, and of a systematic cognition, end quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. Footnote. Hence, Marx, in the Introduction to the Critique of Political Economy, the Introduction to the Grundrisse of 1857, takes up Hegel's theory almost word for word. The concrete is a, quote, manifold connection, end quote, of abstract determinations of thought. End footnote. Like Hegel, Marx finds this kind of knowledge in the methodological progression from the abstract to the concrete, from the universal to the particular. Both Marx and Hegel, these dialectical thinkers, resisted the current sensualism which yielded to the isolated facts given to naive consciousness by viewing them as synonymous with the, quote, concrete, end quote, in general. Just because the sensuous appropriation of the world comes more easily to individuals than a strictly conceptual appropriation does, it does not follow that the beginning of the former is, quote, more natural than that which begins from the subject matter in its abstraction and from the proceeds in the Jesus Christ, I fucked that up. I'm going to repeat that sentence as a whole. Just because the sensuous appropriation of the world comes more easily to individuals than a strictly conceptual appropriation does, it does not follow that the beginning of the former is, quote, more natural than that which begins from the subject matter in the subject matter's abstraction, and from that proceeds in the opposite direction to its particularization and concrete individualization, end quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. Even to pose the question concerning the, quote, more natural, end quote, path of cognition is wrong from the outset. In scientific thinking, quote, a method appropriate to cognition is demanded, end quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. Footnote. See page 588. Here Hegel sets forth with the desired sharpness the difference between a reasoned cognition and historical thinking in the broadest sense. It is not altogether prudent for the structuralists to direct their attack at a, quote, Hegelian, end quote, interpretation of Marx in particular, for it is the science of logic, or the Hegel's greater logic, which in many places supports their own critique of historicism. End footnote. where the hell am I? In scientific thinking, quote, a method appropriate to cognition is demanded, end quote, which, for the sake of exactitude, allows the external genesis of the object to be set aside for the time being. We will now consider the consequences that result from the special way in which Hegel's, quote, method appropriate to cognition, end quote, enters into Marx's Capital. In so doing, we must once again turn to Marx's refracted relationship to material history, or more precisely to the contradictions that Marx's dialectic simultaneously proceeds historically and unhistorically. It proceeds historically insofar as it views cognition and real events as moments of a developing whole. That is, as Lukács emphasized, it points out, on the one hand, that, quote, all the categories in which human existence is constructed must appear as the determinants of that existence itself, and not merely of the description of that existence, end quote. While on the other hand, quote, their succession, their coherence, and their connection must appear as aspects of the historical process itself, end quote. Lukács, History and Class Consciousness. By contrast, the Marxist dialectic proceeds unhistorically, or constructively, as Althusser would put it, by starting out from an existing whole which possesses a complex structure always pre-given, which in turn enables this dialectic to determine the value of the position assigned to all, quote, simple categories in relation to, quote, structural, not, quote, linear causality. Althusser rightly stresses that Marx guards against the myth of a pure beginning, of pure simplicity advocated by a, quote, first philosophy, end quote. But the radical dehistoricization of Marxist materialism, which Althusser presupposes, and which Althusser accomplishes only through an arbitrary use of citations, by no means follows. Certainly Marx views production, to mention a common concept, as always historically determinate, quote, production by social individuals, end quote, who consequently, as Althusser adds, quote, live in a structured social whole, end quote. Althusser for Marx. This is a clear, indisputable state of affairs which serves to support Althusser's thesis concerning the scientific impossibility of reflection on the sequence of history. Althusser writes, quote, Marx does not only deny us the ability to delve down beneath the complex whole, and this denial is a denial in principle. It is not ignorance which prevents us, but the very essence of production itself, its concept. Marx, as also demonstrates, far from being original, Marx also demonstrates, far from being original, simplicity is merely the product of a complex process. The simple only ever exists within a complex structure. The universal existence of a simple category, only appears as the end result of a long historical process, end quote. Althusser for Marx. Let us not be impressed by this. Althusser has nothing to report concerning the, quote, long historical process, end quote, other than that it must have taken place. However, the fact that should be explained is how a, quote, simple category, end quote, such as production, or even more importantly, labor, attains such extensive significance in a social whole. As for the whole itself, we are supposed not to be able to pose questions concerning the whole's genesis. Rather, according to Althusser, we have before us an ever pre-givenness, end quote, as far as, quote, knowledge delves into knowledge's past, end quote. Althusser, for Marx. History thereby, in spite of many assurances to the contrary, is for all practical purposes excluded. In place of a dialectical totality steps a totalism as rigid as it is lacking in content. Footnote. This becomes particularly clear in Althusser's treatment of the doctrine of contradiction. Althusser's most important authority in for Marx is Mao Zedong, whose rather formalistic and ontologically naive conception of the dialectic Althusser appears to share. End footnote. It remains a mystery how Althusser, in view of such premises, wants to conceive of historical development, continuity, and explosive transitions. In Althusser's, quote, Spinoza of social forms, end quote, time appears to forfeit, quote, every relation to the before and after, to linearity, end quote. Althusser. Oh shit, no. It's not Althusser. Raymond Aron. Die Heiligen Familien des Marxismus. See page 208, where Aron, who from an opposing political stance arrives at important insights, especially in relation to the economics and history of Marxism, confronts Althusser's, quote, attempt at timeless historical knowledge, end quote, with Levi-Strauss's, quote, wild thinking, end quote. End footnote. Althusser never tires of referring to Marx's statement that exchange value as the, quote, simplest economic category can never exist other than as an abstract, one-sided relation within an already given, concrete living whole, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. But at the same time, Althusser neglects to observe that here Marx is not putting forth an atemporal methodological canon, but rather is observing the economic structure of bourgeois society. Marx is concerned with the, quote, presentation, end quote, which is model-like and removed, unmediated empirical material of his subject matter, and knows very well that as a result, the question concerning the, quote, relationship between scientific presentation and the real moment, end quote, of history was not settled. And that quote's from Grundrisse, introduction. On the contrary, it called for more careful discussion. Marx, this is the core of materialist epistemology, specifically it explains that the point is to differentiate the, quote, totality as the totality appears in the head as a totality of thoughts, end quote. Following Hegel, Marx calls it, quote, a concrete in the mind, end quote. Ein geistig Konkretes. From the world itself as a real, concrete phenomenon whose own, quote, process of coming into being, end quote, may not be forgotten. Althusser, following this differentiation, correctly sees that the theorist always remains bound to the conceptually mediated present, as the already present totality, and cannot arbitrarily step out of his own constructions. But Althusser falls into speculative idealism, the very same which Althusser so vociferously attacks. If Althusser wants to derive from this the idea that it is scientific to start out from the eternal presence of a logically defined totality, because what distinguishes a constructed object from the real, that is, historical object, can be articulated only within present thought, and thus is a merely illusory difference. Marx handles this problem more adequately. Marx knows that which Althusser firmly adheres to, that the specific role of so-called simple categories is possible only in the sphere of a totality filled with presuppositions. Nevertheless, he opens up the question whether, quote, these simpler categories also have an independent historical or natural existence predating the more concrete ones, end quote. Come on. Marx Grundrisse. That's the end of the quote. That's what the quote's from. In other words, whether these simple categories themselves are not also constitutive for the totality to which they in turn owe their characteristics. This is the case to the degree to which, quote, the simple categories are the expressions of relations within which the less developed concrete may have already realized itself before having posited the more many-sided connection or relation which is mentally expressed in the more concrete category, while the more developed concrete preserves the same category as a subordinate relation, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Commodity production and money are historically possible before wage labor, capital, and banks exist. Therefore, quote, the simpler category can express the dominant relations of a less developed whole, or else those subordinate relations of a more developed whole, end quote, which exist historically before the totality had developed to the point where the totality required a more concrete categorical structure. In this certainly special sense, quote, the path of abstract thought, rising from the simple to the combined, would correspond to the real historical process, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. The categorical expression of the relations of production investigated by Marx rested in a mediated and/or unmediated sense on their history, to the extent to which the thinking process is autonomous in relation to its subject matter and does not slavishly copy it, it leads to theoretical construction. Further, to the extent to which this process remains objectively related to the material of history and continuously subjects itself to its control so as not to ossify into an empty, quote, system, it approaches the level of a critical historiography. Both aspects, relative independence and dependence of the thinking process vis-a-vis the historical process, belong together. As Marx indicates, the fact that at times it appears that they have nothing to do with one another was due to the difference between the, quote, mode of presentation, end quote, Darstellungsweise, and the, quote, mode of inquiry, end quote, Forschungsweise. Quote, the research has to appropriate the material in detail,
to analyze its different forms of development and to track down their interconnection. Only after this work has been done can the real work be appropriately presented. If this is done successfully, if the life of the subject matter is now reflected back in the ideas, then it may appear as if we have before us an a priori construction." End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Whoever has established clarity concerning the objectively contradictory relationship between history and quote system end quote in Capital will not fuse, identify, or separate the historical and the logical, but rather will seek to determine the weight and place of these moments in accordance with the level then attained by the cognitive process. This is certainly a difficult task and is one which the structuralist Marxologist hardly pose, not to mention solve. Althusser's interpretation, which violently divides Marx's work into two heterogeneous parts, does not only sacrifice material history to theoretically constructed history, that is justified on technical grounds and is, within specific limits, unavoidable. However, it signifies an ontological regression because it dispenses with the fundamental insight into the historicity of natural and human social existence. New section: Gramsci's Absolute Humanism of History. When Althusser and Althusser's students disparagingly speak of historicism, they have in mind authors like Lukács, Sartre, and Lefebvre. Of course, the tendency of Marx interpretation, which they rejected as ideological, already existed in optimal form in Gramsci, who Althusser had dealt with more closely, characteristically under the heading of, quote, leftism, end quote. See Althusser/Balibar reading Capital. I have Althusser, I don't know, I've probably already said this in this video, but I have Althusser's contribution to that book. I don't have Balibar's, but I have Althusser's contribution to reading Capital on this channel. Gramsci, an equally sharp as intelligent critic of Bukharin's, quote, mechanism, end quote, was influenced by the neo-Hegelianism of Gramsci's time. Footnote: above all, Croce and Gentile, whose thought he nevertheless criticized as limited to the speculative theological realm. Gentile becoming one of the, I think it's Giovanni Gentile, becoming one of the key philosophers or ideologues of Italian fascism. Further, in a manner similar to Lukács's formulation in History and Class Consciousness, he characterized Marx's theory as a, quote, absolute historicism, absolute humanism of history, end quote, Gramsci, and also as the, quote, philosophy of praxis, end quote, Gramsci. For Gramsci, speculative knowledge, as defined in the section on Feuerbach in the German ideology, dissolves into real history and to historiography. Footnote: Adorno's Marx interpretation also contains this historical element. On Gramsci's thought as a whole, see the knowledgeable and critical study by Christian Reichers, Antonio Gramsci, Marxismus in Italien. End footnote. This corresponds to his, quote, imminent and extreme, quote, subjectivist conception of reality, one in many respects reminiscent of Bogdanov, which he reduced to, quote, pure history or historicity and to pure humanism, end quote. Gramsci. For Gramsci, it was particularly important to define the concept of structure, which has been formalized often enough by bourgeois and Marxist sociologists in relation to its contents, that is, in a radical historical manner, quote, as the ensemble of social relations in which real individuals act and move, as an ensemble of objective conditions which can and should be studied with the methods of philology and not speculation, end quote. Antonio Gramsci. New section. The categories and laws of materialist economics. According to Gramsci, Marxism, understood as, quote, a philosophy of praxis, end quote, does justice to its revolutionary task only when Marxism develops a, quote, general methodology of history, end quote. Gramsci. However, because the wealth and multiplicity of the historical process defy every barren classificatory schema draped over phenomena, and because general, quote, laws of tendency, end quote, can be derived only to the extent to which, quote, particular facts, in those particular facts unique and unrepeatable individuality can be ascertained and specified, end quote. Gramsci. Such a methodology calls for a sharpened philological critical instrument. Conversely, this complicates the issue. There is no continuum between the laws of movement of the social totality derived from earlier research and critical insight and laws based on contemporary empirical material and method. This is the case not only because, from a historical perspective, we are dealing with scarcely compatible phenomena. The categories and laws of materialist economics, regardless of their claims to objectivity, do not express the relations of production of the 19th century in an unmediated or extensive manner. That would be impossible. Rather, they do so in a mediated fashion through slices of abstraction, that is, as an intensive totality. Marx himself emphasizes that as these relations become scientifically fixed, these relations become poorer in definition and lose their historical multiplicity, and consequently their, quote, external, quote, accidental, and, quote, inessential moments as well, which are important in praxis. Marx writes in the third volume of Capital, quote, in a general analysis of this kind, it is usually always assumed that the actual conditions correspond to the actual conditions conception, or what is the same, that actual conditions are represented only to the extent that actual conditions are typical of their own general case, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 3. See volume 3, page 141, where Marx writes that he has not presented, quote, the real movement of competition, end quote, but, quote, only the inner organization of the capitalist mode of production, so to speak. In the capitalist mode of production's, quote, in the capitalist mode of production's ideal average, end quote. Along similar lines, Lenin criticized Struve because he confused the, quote, abstract theory of realization, with concrete historical conditions governing the realization of the capitalist product in some one country and some one epoch, end quote. Lenin. And once more on the theory of realization. Lenin, like Marx, emphasized that the, quote, law of capitalism, depicts only the ideal of capitalism and not capitalism's reality, end quote. It is implemented, quote, only by not being implemented, end quote. Lenin. From all this, it certainly does not follow that Max Weber's all too nominalist interpretation is right. According to Weber, quote, all specifically Marxian laws and development structures ... are ideal types, end quote. Weber underscores the, quote, eminent, indeed unique heuristic significance of these ideal types when they are used for the assessment of reality, end quote. And at the same time warns of, quote, their perniciousness as soon as they are thought of as empirically valid or as real, i.e. truly metaphysical, quote, effective forces, end quote, tendencies, end quote, etc., end quote. Max Weber in The Methodology of the Social Sciences. Of course, Weber was right when in this context, Weber pointed out how unserious it is to turn historical knowledge into, quote, a servant of theory instead of the other way around. It is a great temptation for the theorist to regard this relationship either as the normal one or far worse, to mix theory with history and indeed to confuse theory and history with each other, end quote. Weber. That something like that has not uncommonly appeared in the Marxist tradition is obvious. However, to admit this does not dispose of the legitimate claim of Marxist theory to get hold of objective real circumstances by means of its constructions. In contrast to Weber's ideal types, Marxist categories are entia rationis cum fundamento in re. The class political accent of the Weberian conception. Weberian expresses it in the then current objection that Marx advocated a, quote, materialist metaphysic, end quote, lies in its subjectivism, which reduces Marxist structural laws to the level of heuristic fictions, with whose help the irrational reality, consisting of an enormous sum of singular facts, will be ordered. End footnote. Analyses directed at the particular and individual do not, as a result, become superfluous. Quite the contrary. Important theorists of political economy were always well versed in their own areas of specialization. Nevertheless, it should be kept in mind that empirically or historically attained findings are unable, at least in an unmediated sense, to shake or confirm statements concerning the social totality. It is equally unacceptable to postulate dogmatically a total knowledge that is simply immune from revision in light of newly emergent facts. In Hegel's words, quote, the realm of laws is the stable image of the world of existence or appearance. In it is expressed, the stable content of appearance, ... Appearance is the same content, but presents itself in restless flux and as reflection into other, end quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. Materialistically interpreted, this means analogous to the category of quantity in the logic of being, and that with any specifiable range of variation, the essence, law, remains indifferent vis-a-vis the concrete historical mode of its appearance. Its concept reflects the relatively constant, massive, self-repeating elements in the processes of objective reality. Footnote. Hegel's theory of the law as the stable image of appearances impressed Lenin, whose conspectus on the science of logic notes, quote, this is a remarkably materialistic and remarkably appropriate, with the word, quote, ruhiga, end quote, determination. Law takes the quiescent and therefore Law, every law is narrow, incomplete, and approximate, end quote. Lenin. The idea that apparent appearances are richer than law comes from Hegel himself, but contains an aspect which remained in the background in Hegel's theory, but developed further in dialectical materialism. While Hegel rejected as a, quote, abstract, end quote, precaution, the general thesis according to which all human stages of knowledge have a merely approximate significance owing to their historical and transitory nature, and called for the, quote, exertion of the concept, end quote, which is to be continuously performed anew, Marxist materialism, in this respect more strongly oriented to the actual course of scientific research, from the outset is guided by the former thesis in the construction of its concepts. On this question, see the essay, which picks up the threads of Lenin's Hegel interpretation by Wilhelm Riemendt-Bayer, Hegel's Law. Bayer stresses the, quote, correctability, end quote, completability, end quote, and, quote, controllability, end quote, of the materialistically conceived concept of law. End footnote. If the essence must appear, the essence's content consists of the conceptualized content of the appearances. Hence, changes in these appearances extend to the essence itself. One problematic which forms the background of the contemporary discussion is whether capitalism, since Marx and Lenin, has changed essentially or only inessentially. That is, whether it manifests itself today in economic appearances whose essence is qualitatively different from the one Marx revealed. The category of a relative immiseration of the Western proletariat testifies to the difficulties that emerge in connection with this problematic. New section, Gramsci's concept of historiography. Let us return to Gramsci's problematic. Gramsci had in mind less the constructive concept of history of Marx's Capital than a historiography which, without degenerating into a spiritless chronicle, conformed to historical sequence and would thereby not sacrifice the specificity and non-repeatability of individual persons and events to abstract sociological laws. Even if one disregards for the moment the assumption that the facts of historical development are absolutely singular or theory-free and are accessible only through intuition, a typical prejudice of the human sciences, a problem nevertheless does exist. History, whether constructed or described by political economy, has a different significance for political economy. Where the hell am I? History, whether constructed or described by political economy, has a different significance for political economy than history does for historical scholarship. I don't know if I followed the pronouns right on that, so I'm just going to read it again straight. History, whether constructed or described by political economy, has a different significance for the latter than it does for historical scholarship. The question concerning the relationship of general overarching structures to particular and individual facts presents itself differently in the two cases. In the first volume of Capital, Marx investigates the production of relative surplus value and traces the recent history of industry since the late Middle Ages under the headings, quote, cooperation, quote, division of labor and manufacture, and, quote, machinery and large-scale industry, end quote. In so doing, it is clear to Marx from the beginning that Marx is dealing with a highly generalized material, which Marx subjects to a selective procedure. In Marx's, quote, historical sketches, end quote, Marx presents only, quote, broad and general characteristics for epochs in the history of society are no more separated from each other by strict and abstract lines of demarcation than are geological epochs, end quote. Marx, Capital. Footnote. In a review of Capital, Engels rightly speaks of the, quote, analytic principles of the recent history of industry, end quote, which Marx presented, end footnote. Side note from me, this idea of like, the broad and general characteristics are no more separated from each other by strict and abstract lines of demarcation than are geological epochs. I don't know if I've said this in this video already, but precisely the political Marxists kind of opened my eyes to the fact that there was a certain recreation of the countryside, the recreation of agriculture in Britain in Capital's image in a way that preceded historically the recreation of industry in Capital's image to a large extent. Whereas changes in like certain rationalization of agriculture, capitalist rationalization of agriculture due to the laws of the market, often talked about as like improvements in the literature of the time, as in say like John Locke. So there was like this idea that like you can always like kind of like bracket out these kinds of like stages is difficult, is not something like the production of, you can't really always like say like the production of at least in my opinion, you can't always like suss out exactly the production of absolute surplus value from a relative surplus value, right? Especially when the length of the labor process, the length of lunches, the length of all kinds of things is kind of constantly in tension, right? There's no kind of like I don't know. Basically, what I'm saying is that this kind of like sketch that Marx gives of like stages in production, cooperation, manufacture, machinofacture, those are they're it's not like necessarily like one drops out as each other. I think the main thing is to say that like within that process is that capital and competition puts pressure on firms to trim the fat from their production process and reduce costs in order to compete on the market. There's an endogenous compulsion to technological development within capitalism. Anyway, in other words, in Capital, Marx constructs not only the, quote, economic structure, end quote, of the society presents capitalism, but the development of historical forms in relation to one another as well. Historiography, by comparison, operates on a less elevated level of abstraction. As Gramsci puts it, it calls for a philological method, which takes the concrete content of individual facts into account. If Marxism is reduced to, quote, abstract sociology, unquote, Gramsci criticizes Bukharin's book, Theory of Historical Materialism, on precisely these grounds, quote, a mechanical formula, end quote, would emerge, quote, which gives the impression of holding the whole of history in the palm of its hand, end quote. Gramsci. In fact, Bukharin does characterize Marxist materialism as sociology, and sociology as the, quote, most general bracket, abstract, and bracket of the social sciences, end quote. Bukharin, historical materialism. It takes its material from and provides a method for history. On the other hand, Bukharin separates sociology, understood in this sense, from the contents of economics and history. Bukharin defines sociology as, quote, the general theory of society and the laws of society's evolution, end quote. Bukharin, historical materialism. Without a doubt, material history is thereby devalued, for it faces a theory which is an already closed system of coordinates in which its facts are merely registered. Bukharin does not discuss the opposite and decisive idea that the historical process is constitutive for the theoretical process and modifies the theoretical process's categories. Just as Bukharin completely breaks down when it came to the dialectic, which Bukharin, following Bogdanov, replaced through a kind of equilibrium theory. Footnote. Here it should be recalled that Marx and Engels define the relation between theory and theoretical practice of materialist historical writing differently. Both reciprocally correct one another from case to case. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels write, quote, when the reality is described, a self-sufficient philosophy, die selbstständige Philosophie, loses its medium of existence. At best, that self-sufficient philosophy's place can only be taken by a summing up of the most general results, abstractions which are derived from the observation of the historical development of men. Those abstractions in themselves, divorced from real history, have no value whatsoever. They can only serve to facilitate the arrangement of historical material, to indicate the sequence of its separate strata. But they by no means afford a recipe or schema, as does philosophy, for neatly trimming the epochs of history. On the contrary, the difficulties begin only when one sets about the examination and arrangement of the material, whether of a past epoch or of the present, and its actual presentation. The removal of these difficulties is governed by promises which certainly cannot be stated here, but which only the study of the actual life process and the activity of the individuals of each epoch will make evident. End quote. The German ideology. End footnote. It is no wonder that Bukharin errs also on the question of the structural elements of Marxism. A question does not coincide with the issue of the historical sources of these elements, but rather refers to the qualitatively new aspects of their theoretical content. It was precisely this which Bukharin did not grasp. Gramsci rightly objects that Bukharin mechanistically dissects Marxism into two component parts, into a theory of evolution appearing as sociology, which works according to natural scientific criteria, and as in some contemporary authors leads to an empty typology of historical forms, and into a philosophy in the narrow sense, which amounts to a crude materialism, falsely presenting itself as, quote, dialectical, end quote. Concerning this separation, Gramsci writes, quote, separated from the theory of history and politics, philosophy cannot be other than metaphysics, where the great conquest in the history of modern thought, represented by the philosophy of praxis, is precisely the concrete historicization of philosophy, and philosophy's identification with history, end quote. I'm going to repeat that because I think I fucked that up. Concerning this separation, Gramsci writes, quote, separated from the theory of history and politics, philosophy cannot be other than metaphysics, whereas the great conquest in the history of modern thought, represented by the philosophy of praxis, is precisely the concrete historicization of philosophy and its identification with history, end quote. Gramsci. 2 footnotes here. Footnote. This factually and textually unsupportable departmentalization has continued in Soviet Marxist textbooks up to the present. Of course, today an effort is made to formulate it less crudely. And see also from Gramsci selections, page 436 on this quote, identity of history and philosophy, end quote, Gramsci.